Thanks for coming. I will say I freaked out a little bit when, after agreeing to give this talk, Louise sent me the poster which said Frankenfoods. It didn't have the second part. Because as I'll get to at the end of my talk, I think that the major challenge for us as civilized people is a population that's going to approach 10 billion people within a couple of decades. And our biggest problem as human beings is going to be how to feed all those people. Not to diminish the risks of agriculture, of pesticides, of genetically modified foods, which is what we'll talk about today. But I did want to start out by putting this in a context that is the same one Mary Shelley used, because ironically, the title of the book is not just Frankenstein, it's Frankenstein or the New Prometheus. That's her title. And Prometheus, of course, was the Greek god, actually a titan, who stole fire from the gods and gave it to human beings. And that fire is a symbol in Greek mythology of knowledge, of technology, of power. And the book is very much a metaphor about that power. And I think that's really the theme I'd like to continue, not just the monster and the horror and the murders and all the things that happened to Frankenstein's creation, but the themes that Mary Shelley was trying to look at. So that's just as a preamble where I hope we'll go with this. So I'm really fortunate to be part of Bentley. I've been there for about 10 years, both in the science department and the management department. And Bentley, when we came, we really focused very much on a couple of issues. We actually have a science department focused on two things, one sustainability and one health. And those, of course, are the themes that we'll hit today when we talk about food. So I'll start out with the question, what are your plans for dinner tonight? And I think that looks delicious. It's a nice white meat chicken breast, nice, large, juicy, looks well cooked, corn, which looks like it's been cooked on a grill, some kale. So one of the questions is it Frankenfood? Because this is actually not a picture of genetically engineered chickens. These are normal chickens. This is what on the left is what a chicken looked like, a commercial broiler in 1957. That's what we would have bought when I was about 3 years old. And the other is what the chicken looked like in 2005 that you got at the store, and it's even bigger now. And there are no hormones involved. There's no genetic engineering involved. What there is selective breeding. So for 50 years, Purdue Farms in particular has always taken the biggest hen and the biggest rooster. It's way more sophisticated than that, but you breed them together, you get bigger offspring. And you do that, chickens will breed a couple of times a year, you do that 100 times, and the chickens have become unrecognizable as a species from what they were only 50 years ago. And I'll show you some slides. We've been doing this for thousands of years as human beings. So, is that a Frankenfood? No hormones, no genetic engineering. This is what we consider normal. Okay, now why have we done this? Well, we've done it, first of all, because people like white meat. Right? White meat sells, dark meat, not so much. So the ratio of white meat to dark meat is about 5 times now what I grew up with. So you can have those gorgeous chicken breasts that we had on the first slide. They grow faster, and therefore they cost less. So the chickens, the size of these chickens is the least of it. These chickens not only grow larger, but they get to that size with less food than a chicken did 50 years ago to get to full size. So it's less feed, less time, less space, bigger profits, but also a better consumer product. And as we'll talk about, consumers drive all this. We like white meat. That's what sells. That's what Purdue is going to put on our shelves for us. Okay, so what they've changed is not just the size and the shape, they've totally changed the metabolism of this animal simply by taking the biggest rooster and the biggest hen. Now they're measuring hundreds of traits. Maybe the one that eats the less and gets the biggest, right? They measure everything. And I'll show you an example of corn later on where you could customize corn for Waltham, Massachusetts, and all sorts of things. So what drives this is what's shown here. What drives this is consumer demand. In the 1950s, we discovered we liked hamburger. So McDonald's, the first McDonald's is on the slide there. And what you had then was 30 years of massive increases in the amount of beef we ate as a nation. We still do. It's not necessarily McDonald's, it's Five Guys up the street here or Shake Shack, but we have this fixation on hamburgers and beef as a society, and to some extent driven by marketing, but also just driven by our tastes. We also have been increasing the amount of chicken we eat for a long time. Chicken was not a common food. Poultry in general was not a common food for Americans 100 years ago or even 50 years ago. But the biggest increase, even more than beef, is the amount of chicken we're eating. You could see at the same time, we're eating less eggs. The amount of veal and lamb we eat has gone down to almost nothing. It's actually hard to find sometimes in a store. They're considered less socially acceptable. So this is consumerism, right? We do like to blame the companies for it, but we don't everywhere else. Companies will put on the shelves whatever we're willing to pay, and that's kind of what we teach at Bentley. It's business school. Okay, so that's introducing, you could do a lot of things without genetic engineering. So the question is that beautiful, delicious watermelon on the right of Frankenfood? The picture on the left is about a 300-year-old painting of what a normal watermelon used to look like. But for 300 years, farmers have been taking the best male watermelon plant. Plants have sex, by the way. I don't know if we can talk about sex in this audience, but it's plants, so maybe it's okay. So they've been taking the male, female germplasm, crossing it to make bigger, juicier, faster growing watermelons. And I'm not sure we would have a big market for the one on the left, but we do the one on the top right. The one on the bottom right created a sensation. It was in the New York Times a couple of years ago. Some of you may have seen this. It's a square watermelon. It's a cube, perfect cube. And people assume this was genetic engineering. No, this is you grow it in a box. This is, if anybody ever grown watermelon, watermelon is this vine that will take over your garden, completely take it over. And what they did is they took over the garden, and every time they had a little watermelon bud, they put it in a box. There was a cube, and the watermelon ended up a perfect cube. That has enormous economic advantages to the producers because they can stack them, they can ship them, they can fill a big truck with it, and there's no empty space. Consumers didn't care for it very much. It kind of looked like a Frankenfood, and people didn't buy it. So you're not going to find a cube watermelon on your shelves. But again, my point is, this is normal. We consider this normal. Growing food in a box doesn't scare us. Okay, these are even more exciting. The one on the right is a Jello. How many have had Jellos? I love Jellos. Jello is a cross between a tangerine and a grapefruit. So you take the male germplasm of one, and you take the female germplasm of the other, and you get a completely new species. Never existed on this planet before. Blood limes are very trendy. They make really good drinks. Anyone ever had a cocktail with a blood lime? Blood limes are a cross between a red lime and a mandarin orange. And the top left, that's a strawberry. And that actually is less exotic. That's taking some strawberry-like thing that grew in Hawaii, which is not cross-fertilized with anything in the mainland in a couple of thousand years, crossing it with a wild strawberry, and you get a white strawberry. I mean, it's beautiful, right? Frankenfood? We okay with that one? You're not so sure about the white strawberry, I can tell. Okay. Doesn't look right. Absolutely. Okay. So The changes are even more extreme when we look at our main foodstuffs. So wheat was cultivated about 5,000 years ago in the Middle East for the first time. And what they started with is this wild wheat on the left. And I gotta admit, I've never understood how a primitive person looked at that and saw a loaf of bread. But every culture did, right? They did in the Americas, they did in Africa, they've done it on islands in the Pacific. But they've done the same thing now for thousands of years of breeding the crops that are going to give more seeds, because that's where the flour comes from, less chaff. And you've gone to various varieties of species so that what you have now is completely unrecognizable plant. That's wild type wheat. And Jared Diamond, in his classic book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, actually goes through this story because he thinks this is one of the enabling events of civilization and technology. Another one of my favorites, I never knew this till I got ready for this talk. It turns out that cauliflower, broccoli, kale, Brussels sprouts, and cabbage are actually identical plants. They have the same genome, right? They only differ in a few bases here and there. What's been done? Well, for a couple of hundred years, and this is a picture that comes from Kew Gardens, where they study all this stuff in London. There's one where they selected for flowers. Ooh.
That's the Frankenstein.
That's Frankenstein, yes, it's out there. If you select for flowers, you get big flowers, and cauliflower is the flower. If you select for flower and stems, you get broccoli. If you select for leaves, you get kale. And in each case, you want the biggest yield. So you do the one with the biggest leaves, you get kale. Biggest flowers, probably. You do this hundreds of times. You can it's hard to imagine the cabbage and cauliflower are the same genetic material. Okay, this is what you do with simple, normal. I think if you had lived on the thing up at the top, which is a mustard seed of some sort, if you thought that was normal, cauliflower would look really scary. Actually, it looks really scary to my kids anyway. But, okay. Probably the most dramatic changes are corn, which was that other beautiful thing on that plate we started with. The one on the left is called Tocente, which was corn. That's wild corn. That's what you find in the wild. And again, through a process of selection, the first one is probably what the Aztecs and the Mayans were cultivating, not what we have today. It got somewhat more advanced. The middle ones, a lot of work was done when corn was taken to Europe, because that didn't grow really well in Europe, so other varieties were cultivated. Farmers were very good at this. And the one on the right is what we have today. This is hybrid selection. Very highly selected. One of the things is people don't like those black kernels on the corn. When you go to your grocery store, people who study this, well, if there are a couple of black kernels, people won't buy that one. They'll buy the one where they're all yellow. So industry will spend a lot of time selecting very yellow corn with very yellow corn to be sure they have the product consumers are going to buy. And we haven't even got to the modification yet. It just points out what you do. What you do is you take the male germplasm is up at the top of the plant. The female germplasm is at the tip of the corn itself. And the old-fashioned way is you take off the top, you brush the bottom, and that what we call hay fever, what we call the allergens that float around, that's the germplasm of the plants. And you could do that very systematically. You can do this on an industrial scale. You can go through a field, cut the top off every male plant to make sure there's no wild type male germplasm. You can now go buy a 50-pound bag of of the male germplasm you want to use, and you spread it all over your field and fertilize every corn in your field with the particular germplasm you want. And this is a very important technique, and it's very powerful. So that type of industrial cross, we're going beyond now the farmer who takes his biggest chicken and his biggest hen and rooster. This is now beginning to do it on a very systematic basis. One of the first great people to do this was the Nobel laureate Norman Borglum, who is the father of the Green Revolution. Because he discovered if you do this systematically, you can make anything you wanted. If you wanted rice or corn or wheat that would grow in drought conditions, you could do it. If you could do wheat or corn or rice that would stand up to a hurricane and survive, you could do it. If you wanted better nutrients, fire resist, almost anything you wanted. And what worked in Mexico, where he did his first work, didn't work in Bangladesh, where he did his most important work. So what this did is hybrid seeds really originated in the 40s. And you could see that the corn yield, the amount of corn this very systematic industrial scale hybrid creation has given massive increases in the amount of corn we get per acre of field. Okay, this does a lot of things. We'll go through some of them later, but first of all, we use a lot less land. If you can get 140 bushels per acre instead of 20, you may need 8 times less land, because you may need 8 times less farmers working the land to get the same amount of crop. It's cheaper. Importantly, you need much less fertilizer, because you fertilize per acre. There's a lot of different things that happen in response to this. Now, one of the things that's created is an industry. It turns out that when you make that first cross, it's called an F1. It's a hybrid, has nomenclature like everything else. That F1 generation is a hybrid, and it has what's called hybrid vigor. Hybrid vigor is real. When you take 2 species that are closely related enough to crossbreed, and you bring them together, you generally get a much more robust animal or plant than you do if you keep inbreeding. Matter of fact, inbreeding is really bad for animals and plants. You see this in show animals, particularly show dogs. When you inbreed show dogs to get that perfect whisker that could win the thing, you end up with bad hips and bad hearts. The animals don't live as long. When you begin to do your outcrosses, so my family, my mother used to breed border collies, and they have a rule. They have to go back to Scotland every 2 generations, bring in new blood to be sure they don't inbreed. They want to keep the species healthy. That's part of why golden doodles and all the other crosses people are doing actually lead to healthier animals. So that F1 generation that's where the money is. That's where the value is. Now, the problem is if you take that F1 and you start breeding it back against itself, you lose it all. Okay, so in the old days, a farmer would have a field. They'd grow corn. They'd sell most of it. They'd put some of it in the barn. Next year came, they'd take that corn, they'd put it back in their field. That's how we think about farming, right? With hybrid crops, that's not a good idea. If you keep doing that, as sort of shown here, the plants will get worse and worse and worse. So there are enormous companies whose primary business is selling hybrids. Okay, famously Monsanto, which is now part of Bayer, is the granddaddy of them all. Pioneer Hybrids was probably the second biggest, was part of DuPont, may become independent again. And they're doing billions of dollars a year of sales of hybrid seeds. Now, that has social ramifications. Farmers can't just go to their barn and plant the seeds from last year's crop. It's not going to work well. Okay, so these companies, we'll get back to this with some of the criticism of genetically modified foods, that's not where they make all their money. Actually, they make their money on hybrids. Okay, so this is how they make their money. I did this yesterday. This is kind of fun. I went to the Pioneer Hybrid website, and it said, what area code do you want to grow your corn? So I punched in 02452, Bentley University. We should have a cornfield now. I could have done the community farm across the street down at the extension school, right? And it showed me every column here is a different hybrid in their catalog. And you can select which one I may want to grow by what are the criteria I want. Actually, what they really want is they want to send their sales rep out to help me choose, right? But I could choose for stalk strength. Maybe I'm worried about the undergrads playing frisbee in my cornfield, and I want strong stalks. Maybe I want to go for root strength. Maybe I want to go for stress emergence. Maybe I'm really worried about global warming. I think they're going to be very stressed. Maybe I'm worried about the residue and whether that will be digestible, so on and so forth. All sorts of different things. And for each of these, you can't see now, each of the dots in the middle is a number of how strong that attribute is for that particular hybrid. And I can now choose a hybrid that will meet my needs, planting a cornfield in the middle of Bentley University. Okay, this is how farming is done now. Okay, and it's not cheap, but this is now a crop that's likely to survive. It's been a long time since we had major agricultural failures in this country or worldwide, okay, because of this type of technical prowess. And this is the consequence of hybrids. So if you look at soybeans, at corn, at wheat, at cotton, at rice, at aggregate crops, there have been dramatic reductions in the cost of producing food. Okay, so much so that the prices are so low you almost can't grow it anymore. Heavy subsidies are frequently necessary because of increased yields. Right? So this is a very powerful technology. Now, there are a few consequences for this. One is the Green Revolution. Right? I introduced this at the very beginning. The Green Revolution really had about 5 parts as classically formulated. The key was hybrid varieties of crops, because up through the 60s and 70s, you would have massive famines. Hundreds of thousands of people in places like Bangladesh and Central and South Africa. If you had a year of bad crops, or God forbid 2 years of bad crops, thousands of people would die and their growth would be stunted. The WorldHunger.org says now, it's in green here, the world does produce more than enough food for every person on this planet. Now, why is there hunger? There's almost 1 billion people who are undernourished. It's distribution, okay? Wars, lack of transportation, rottage, the amount of food that's rotted before it could get where it's going is a serious problem. But the world has not had a major famine in about 20, 25 years. That's never happened before in human history. So that's the biggest benefit of the hybrids. Now, the other parts of it are more controversial. Irrigation, okay, not very controversial, but that uses a lot of water, right? So part of this led to a lot of damming, a lot of water redistribution, increased fertilizer and pesticide use. This is an important part of the Green Revolution. We're still learning how to deal with. I'll come back to that a little bit later. And infrastructure development, getting the food into a distribution network that was global in reach so that, have there been bad crops in India? Oh yeah, they've had bad crops in India, but people haven't starved. There's a distribution network. Have there been bad crops in South Africa? Absolutely. There's distribution networks. There aren't in Somalia and Sudan and places like that where it's hard to get food, even though there's ample food on the planet. For you guys, this is the biggest benefit. The percent of our income that we use to buy food has been dropping for about 50 years. Right? We used to spend about 25 or more % of our disposable income on food. We now spend about 12. Okay, now it's really not quite that good. I'm exaggerating a little bit because we eat out a lot. Our habits have changed. So if you put in the total food, it's more like, actually it's still around 10, 12%. It would be even less if we ate at home. And what's the, I'm blanking on the name of the food delivery company you cook. That's not going to make it cheaper. Blue Apron. That's not going to make it cheaper. Cooking at home is when you go to your refrigerator, you eat your leftovers, right? That's really cost effective. But this is an important trend. What's happened to that money? We spend it on entertainment. We spend it on houses that average The average house people are buying now is 1,000 square feet bigger than it was in the 60s. It's just going other places. We're using it. We have more choices. And that's a direct consequence of the Green Revolution. Okay. What about genetically modified foods? Right, nobody's freaked out about anything I showed yet, right? You didn't like the strawberries. I'm not sure I want square watermelons. None of that horrifies us, right? So what happens when you do a cross? When you do a cross, you're taking two plant genomes, which are huge. The plant genome, by the way, is 4 times bigger than the human genome. It's not that they're smarter, they just have more genes. Without knowing anything about any of the 30 or 40,000 genes in there, you're crossing them. Sometimes you're actually purposely introducing mutations. That's part of when you do industrial scale selection, you want to purposely take 2 plants that are pretty different and cross them to see what you get. You do a lot of experimentation and you get a hybrid. Doesn't bother us. Genetically modified foods, on the other hand, we're not sure about. As a society, we're very not sure. Okay, so what is a genetically modified food? Okay, so this is the most common one. Virtually all of the corn you eat, the clothes you wear, and many other things in your life, like canola oil, are probably genetically modified with BT corn. Or BT other things, I'll show you. So what is this? So BT is a toxin. BT stands for bacterial toxin. And it prevents what you're seeing on the right. It prevents worms and caterpillars from destroying the crop. Traditionally, the way you dealt with this is there is a bacteria, Bacillus thuringiensis, that makes a toxin. It's normal. These generally live in your fields. And the bacteria make a toxin that kills the caterpillars. To be sure it's there, normal practice was to grow a lot of bacteria, take it up in your airplane, fly over your field, and spray your field. So a normal practice, actually an organic practice, would be to spray your field with the bacteria. The bacteria makes the toxin. You hope that it gets all over the plants, so you actually use a lot of it. Caterpillars eat the toxin. They don't eat your corn. BT corn takes the same gene that codes for exactly the same toxin, and you now inject the gene into the seed of a corn. The corn now makes the toxin, and it sits on the leaf, just as it does when you spray the bacteria. Actually, you engineer it, so it's only on the leaves. Okay? So BT corn is the classic genetically modified food. Is this the thunderstorm we're hearing? Yeah. And it has one additional gene, which is the one that comes from the bacteria. It's very effective, and you don't have to use insecticide. Okay, so when you take a field, what's showing here in green is the percentage of the fields that are planted with BT corn. And the blue is the amount of insecticide that's being used to grow that corn. And in fact, when you get up to about 60, 70% of your fields being BT corn, you don't have to spray any of them. There's a mass effect. It's like influenza vaccine. If enough fields have BT, you don't even have caterpillars in the neighborhood. Okay, so this is complicated. How many of us want to eat a genetically modified corn that's making a bacterial toxin? That does not sound appetizing. How many of us want to eat corn that's not been sprayed with insecticide? Now, that sounds okay. How are we going to decide? I don't have an answer. Okay, this is another very common one. This is probably the most controversial. This is called Roundup Ready crops. Everybody know what Roundup is? Roundup is an herbicide. I always have a can of it next to the door of my house, so when I go out and I have weeds, I can just spray them in the morning when I'm getting my newspaper and stuff. Roundup is one of many herbicides. I'll come back to that point in a minute. that are used. And it works like any drug. It's a drug, quite honestly. You call it an herbicide, it's a drug. And it blocks the ability of plants to make proteins. And it does it by, the way drugs work is they bind to a protein. So on the right you have a picture, it doesn't project real well, it's a big protein, a normal protein in the plant. And the little darker thing in the middle, not easy to see at the moment, is where the drug binds. And when it binds, this protein doesn't do its job. So that a plant that's been exposed to Roundup dies. It can't grow. It can't make proteins. But it turns out there is a bacteria which has the same protein, very slightly different structure, because every species has a very slightly different structure. But the normal protein in the bacteria is not inhibited by Roundup. It works just fine. Roundup comes in and it doesn't care. So Roundup Ready crops, what they've done is they've taken the gene, the normal gene from a bacteria, injected it into a corn seed, and many other crops also. So in addition to the normal protein that would normally be inhibited by Roundup, it also makes this protein, which doesn't necessarily belong there, but it's normal in bacteria, which is impervious to Roundup. So now what happens? What happens is you spray your whole field with Roundup, all the weeds, they're not resistant. They die. The crop that has this version of the protein, that survives. Okay, so that's what Roundup Ready crops are. It's a way for a farmer with kind of one shop stopping to eliminate all the weeds on the field and have their crop not affected by this drug. So what's the consequence of this? Again, it's complicated. So the left, we'll do the left first. The left shows that the more of your field you plant with this, well, the more of the drug you use. The drug is called glyphosate. Okay, that's Roundup. The real name of Roundup is glyphosate. It's a drug. We don't like drugs. But the more of this crop you plant, the more you can practice something called no-till agriculture. No-till agriculture is not high technology, but it's one of the most powerful things going on in the agricultural world, which is, turns out you don't have to plow your fields. You can actually just go through and kind of inject your seed into the field. And this is the way of the future. You're not going to have farms with big rows where you dramatically turn everything over. It turns out that's really bad for fields. It's bad for drainage, it's bad for the soil, it causes erosion, because instead of having a protective layer, everything's on top. There are a lot of reasons why no-till agriculture it's way cheaper. Why did you used to till? Well, you were getting rid of the weeds. You were turning them under, you hoped they'd stay under long enough, and they wouldn't come back up. So you don't have to till your field to get rid of the weeds, so you can practice no-till agriculture, which is, for many reasons, a little beyond me. I'm actually not an expert in this part, is a much more sustainable, environmentally friendly way to farm. And overall, on the right, what you show here, and this I'm going to have to point to. Is this okay? You certainly use more glyphosate. That's the product. That's the one they're resistant to. You actually stopped using a bunch of others that were actually way more toxic. So glyphosate may or may not be safe. Complicated question. A lot of the others, definitely not safe. Okay, so you've had a little bit Monsanto taking market share. This is business, right? This is their product. This other one, that's their competitor's product. Right? You got to use their Roundup if you use their Roundup Ready crops. No accident. Overall, you're using slightly less herbicide than you used to. Okay, but this is the one that gets everybody more upset than anything else. You are using a lot more of this glyphosate. Okay, and we'll say never been shown to be dangerous. There's zero evidence of it being dangerous. There are a lot of questions, and the questions are really fair. Okay, there are reasons that one needs to look very closely at this drug, at this herbicide, this drug. Some of these others, yeah, you don't want. Some of the old-fashioned ones you really don't want in your neighborhood. One of the reasons glyphosate was developed in the first place is that the molecule you put in, used as a drug, actually has no biological activity whatsoever. It has to be activated by plants. So this is one that's relatively safe for animals. But again, a lot of questions about that, totally legitimate questions. So what's with genetically modified foods? Well, it really is mainstream agriculture now. It's very hard to avoid. We used to do a lab at Bentley with our freshmen where you buy things that are supposedly genetically modified, GMO free. They're not. They're really not. It's just a question of how sensitive your methods are. These are out there for all the major crops. Almost 100% of cotton, sugar beet, soybean, corn, and canola oil are genetically modified. That's the normal product now. Why papaya? There was a papaya blight. These are crops that have been in trouble in the past, or increasingly genetically modified. And in the Western world, well, in the United States, in the Americas, this is now normal. We could talk about Europe separately. And it's grown very rapidly since the emergence. And many now have 2 or 3 modifications. You can be both Roundup Ready and BT and things like that. Okay, so are they safe, right? That's the argument that's going on. Nobody trusts Monsanto. Nobody trusts Pioneer hybrids. The National Academy of Sciences last year did a report, came out in December, where they really brought together every major scientific society to review all of the data out there. And this is their conclusion, that there's certain things you can't measure. You can never really prove something's safe. It's not how science works. You can't prove a negative in science. Okay, you can ask, is there evidence for it being not safe? And you can only do that. You can only do the experiments you can do. You can't do an experiment to say, is this going to have a side effect in 50 years? You can't prove it doesn't. It might. You can't prove that. This is one of the problems with doing drug trials. It's very hard to prove if something doesn't have a side effect in 1 in 100,000 people. This actually was the problem with Vioxx, right? Vioxx increased heart attacks. But the frequency was less than the 50,000 people they had in their trial. And then they lied about it. That was the worst part, right? So there are limitations to what you can do. So there are unknowns. There are real questions about many of these. Not actually the genetic modification. There's actually, it's worth saying there's no theoretical reason in the world, zero, why a genetically modified food should be any different than a normal one. There's actually nothing artificial in there. DNA is the same DNA molecule as every other DNA molecule. It's a question, what do they make? They make proteins. Proteins don't get out of your stomach. Proteins hit the acid in your stomach and they're no longer proteins. They're amino acids and the building blocks. So there's nothing actually artificial in the food part. But that doesn't mean you don't ask the questions in the studies. The glyphosate question, that's an important question. You're using way more of it than you used to. Okay. So, you know, the evidence of not the companies now was there's no evidence, no substantiated evidence of a difference in risk to human health between the currently commercialized genetically engineered crops and conventional crops. They also found no evidence of environmental problems coming from it, no substantiated evidence. Now, there are a lot of stories out there. One of the stories is that Monsanto sues farmers who grow seeds that they picked from last year. That actually turns out not to be true. Never happened. There was one kind of weird case about 20 years ago. which started the story. Monsanto's never sued a farmer. Yeah, would a farmer do well using their crops? No, it probably wouldn't work real well. Okay, so it's very hard to go through, and I'll do this more when I talk about the hardest one of all, to really separate the facts from not the facts. And in this world of alternative facts, the political left isn't always that much better than the political right. Okay? And that was brought home with a really stunning article in the New York Times a couple of years ago. Mark Linus is a well-known environmentalist, a real spokesman for the movement for many years, and he wrote this op-ed piece. And it's worth reading because I think this was stunning coming from him. As a lifelong environmentalist, I opposed genetically modified foods in the past. I even participated in vandalizing fields in Britain. Then I changed my mind. After writing 2 books on the science of climate change, I decided I could no longer continue taking a pro-science position on global warming and an anti-science position on GMOs. There is an equivalent level of scientific consensus on both issues. I realized that climate change is real and genetically modified foods are safe. I could not defend the expert consensus on one issue while opposing it on the other. Okay, that's really hard for him to write. Okay, but I do think that there's a point here. How do we know if something is safe? Okay, we might be scared of it, right? But there is an absolute consensus of the scientific community on global warming. And there's just as much evidence about genetically modified foods being safe. Now, does that mean we're not going to learn something in the future? Yeah, we might. That's the way science works. Science works by things coming up you don't expect, and you revise your theories. Okay, but a lot of this is a question of what are the issues, and I would maintain safety of GMO foods is not one. Now, are GMO foods good? There are problems with GMO foods. The biggest one, and the reason they're banned in Europe, is it's really bad for an agrarian small farm culture. Okay? These seeds work really well on big farms. To take advantage of no-till agriculture, you need 100 acres or 1,000 acres. Okay? So does this promote massive industrial farming? You bet. If you're a rural region in France or England that values the bucolic stone fields, you don't want this. You don't want to compete against it. That's an absolutely fair economic argument, a social argument, a political. It's not a science argument. Okay, and it's disingenuous to say that's going to be solved by safety. Okay, are they different strains of crops? One of the first GMO foods I didn't talk about is something called the Flavor Saver tomato. It was a complete disaster. Flavor Saver tomato actually had nothing artificial in it at all. Turns out we've all had tomatoes that sit in the refrigerator too long. They get really disgusting, right? They get soupy and sappy and you don't want to eat them. They're actually fine. It turns out tomatoes auto-digest themselves. So tomatoes make an enzyme that digests from the inside, and that's why you get that thing. Well, it turns out you can knock that out. So you can make tomatoes which don't digest themselves. Well, industry thought this was great. Actually, consumers did too. They last longer. You put them in your refrigerator. I go back to my refrigerator and I eat the onion that's been there for a month, but I can't eat the tomato because onions don't digest themselves. But it turns out tomatoes have been so highly selected by that old hybrid selection I was talking about to have really thick skins. Right? Wild tomatoes, you guys had organic tomatoes? They're wonderful. It's a different species. It's almost a different strain, not a different species. Because they have that nice thin skin, that juice just pops right out at you. Some cherry tomatoes still do that. You start to bite and they explode. Flavor Saver? No, it was like biting through the outside of a cucumber. Okay? it was not as good. Didn't taste as good. It wasn't, that's not what people wanted in a tomato. Genetically modified foods are a particular strain. That may not be the strain you want. You may really like that corn where not every kernel is perfectly yellow. Tastes a little different, right? Okay, so is that safe? No, not a safety issue. Science is not going to decide that one. And again, it's disingenuous to get them mixed up. So here's the most complicated one. Frankenfish. This is also my favorite one. Frankenfish is a genetically engineered salmon that has now been approved for marketing. Okay, so what is this one? Turns out salmon only grow half the year because they have a growth hormone gene that's only turned on and only makes growth hormone in warm water. So half the year, salmon don't grow. They are whatever size they are. And if you're fish farming, you're feeding them, and salmon are expensive because salmon are carnivorous. So feeding a salmon for 6 months while they're just sitting there enjoying life, not good farming practice. So a local company, this is a company over in Lexington, didn't start there, put a second growth hormone gene in these animals. The gene they use is actually from a Pacific salmon. They took an Atlantic salmon. They took the normal growth hormone gene from Pacific salmon, but they engineered it so it comes on in cold water, not warm water. So they have a salmon now where half the year it grows because the water's warm and the normal Atlantic salmon gene is on. The other half the year, the Pacific salmon growth hormone gene is turned on. They're actually identical, but you can tell them apart with molecular analysis so they could study it. So now these salmon grow all year so that the normal salmon will reach market size in about 3 years, whereas these reach market size, this is market size in about 2 years. Okay. When they're done, and a lot of work's been done, they are exactly the same size. It's just like people who give growth hormone to their kids. Their kids don't get any bigger, they just get big fast. They end up the same size. So the genetically engineered salmon end up the same size. The picture the guy holding two, he's holding them at about 1 year of age. They're very different. Chemically, nutritionally, composition-wise, there's no difference. Neither of them have any growth hormone in by the time they go to market. You can't measure any. Okay. It just takes less time. And man, has this created a stink. So they applied for approval to market this back in the late 90s, almost 17, 18 years ago. In 2005, the FDA and the Environmental Protection Agency did the safety studies, the environmental studies, concluded that there was no risk to these. Various consumer groups complained to their congressmen, and a letter was written by a bunch of politicians to the FDA that said, don't approve this, or we'll threaten your budget. So this went back and forth. This has been one of the ugliest things. Meanwhile, there's a company sitting over in Lexington that basically went out of business because they couldn't sell anything. They didn't have any employees. They got rid of all their employees. And look at the stuff here is really, really pretty striking. A two-headed fish, banned GMO salmon. Well, no, they're not selling two-headed fish. That's not what this is about. This is gorgeous. The FDA approves GMO salmon in the lower left. That is a monster. That's not what they're selling. The one on the right, I think, is very colorful. I like the banana fish. Actually, I wanted to buy one of those. I thought that might be really interesting. And the one on the right, you put a close-up lens on a lot of things that look really hideous. So this is propaganda, right? This is a political campaign. It was decided by politicians. Okay. The most striking misinformation was this. Red alert, FDA to approve first Frankenfish. Take action now, protect salmon. Top right, Alaska's ecosystem depends on wild salmon. The one on the lower right, wild salmon cookout. Turns out there aren't enough wild salmon anymore on this planet to feed people. I was on Bloomberg Radio with this about a year ago with the head of the World Salmon Fisheries Protection Environmental Group. He made the statement on the air that if you ever walk into a restaurant or a store and they claim they're selling you wild salmon, you should sue them for fraud. Okay? To show you how bad the situation is for salmon in the wild, this is a report that came out about a month ago on the Yukon River. How many of you could find the Yukon River on a map? Not only is it in Alaska, it's in North Alaska. Right? This is the middle of nowhere. There are so few salmon running the Yukon River now that the natives who fish for subsistence are no longer allowed to take fish out of the river because it could threaten the stocks. I don't know what they do with the grizzly bears. I hope the grizzlies are allowed to still eat the bears. There's no commercial fishing allowed anymore. They think if they do this, there will be enough salmon escaping that they'll have a run next year. That's the best prediction they have. Okay? It's worse in Washington. It's worse in Maine. Okay, a lot of what's called wild salmon, so basically almost all the salmon we have is fish farmed. Okay, and there's a real dirty line between fish farming and wild. A lot of the fish farming, and it depends on whose information you read, whether they call it wild or farmed. Most of the salmon we get are grown in fjords, either in Norway or Chile, or there's an island off the north coast up in the Arctic where they basically will fence off a fjord and fill it with salmon. This is fish farming, but it's kind of in the wild. So sometimes they sell it as wild, sometimes some jurisdictions will require they label it as farmed. This is the worst thing for the environment. These are very dense concentrations of salmon. Salmon are carnivorous, so they have to throw an enormous amount of fish waste in. They're relying on natural tides to get rid of the fish waste. And if a virus or a pathogen comes in, they have to eliminate the whole flock. Okay. The model here, actually, Tom Stodish, who runs AquaBounty, has made things way worse. He's made the politics as bad as possible. He's a nice guy. He wants to sell his genetically modified salmon as organically grown, locally sourced salmon. Because he's going to grow the small fish, the little tiny, there's a name for them. I'm not a fish person. And he will only sell it to people who are going to do less than 1 acre. And he'll only sell it to people who are going to sell salmon in his area. Hence, locally sourced. And he doesn't need any chemicals because if your fish farm isn't terribly dense, and if you're not in a fjord, you don't have to worry about pathogens. So he doesn't have to fill it with antibiotics and things you do in massive farms. I don't think the world's ready for organic, locally sourced GMO salmon. I don't think that one's going to work. So that's the first thing, right? So this is not protecting the wild stocks of salmon. If you want to protect the wild stocks of salmon, what you do is you stop fishing them. We had a symposium. I have a slide. Actually, I should have put the slide in this way. We had a symposium at Bentley about a year or so ago called Innovation for a Sustainable Sea, where we had Jello Helgarth, who was the CEO of the New England Aquarium, a really wonderful marine biologist, a wonderful woman. We had Brian Helmuth, who's a member of the National Climate Advisory Panel. We had Ron Stodish, who runs AquaBounty. And we had Michael Walsh, who's a postdoctoral fellow in my research group, who studies algae as a food source. And I thought there might be controversy, particularly because Tom likes controversy. Tom will make outrageous statements and loves people taking shots at him. I figured who better than the head of the New England Aquarium to challenge genetically modified foods? And she was unequivocal. She thought no one should ever be allowed to take a salmon out of the wild again, or they're going to go extinct. And she was arguing the salmon should be considered, particularly certain subspecies, which should be considered almost an endangered species. Brian actually was even more supportive. He made the point, this is the last place in the world. We don't go in the forest and hunt our food anymore, right? That wouldn't be considered natural and sustainable. But we do the same thing in the oceans, right? So they were very much in favor of this. And so, in fact, there's a problem here, okay? Which is, if we think fish is better than beef, and it's way better than beef, it's better for your health, it's better for the environment, it's less carbon emissions, where's it going to come from? Unless we find ways to grow it more efficiently, okay? That's Tom Stoddish's argument at AquaBounty. Now, is this the perfect food? No, I think he can come up with a better one. Okay, but what is this? Is this a Frankenfood, or is this in fact a sustainable practice? Okay, so I'll just conclude with Norman Borlaug. Again, Norman Borlaug was really a great humanitarian. Some of the great quotes about him is, no one else has ever saved the lives of 1 billion people during their lifetime. He's the father of the Green Revolution. He did save 1 billion lives by preventing famines for more than a quarter of a century. His point is, we have the ability to feed a population of 10 billion people. We will hit 10 billion people in our lifetimes. Okay, that's way more people than this planet should have. But we don't think that's not an ethical choice, right? We feed people, we care about people, we take care of them. We want to make sure they have food. The pertinent question is whether farmers and ranchers will be permitted to use this new technology. Now this is Norman Borlaug's perspective. Remember, his Nobel Prize is for preventing famines in Mexico, in Africa, and Bangladesh. It says, while the affluent nations can certainly afford to adopt ultra-low-risk positions, okay, we're not happy about glyphosate. We're not really happy about some of these genetic modifications. No demonstrated risk of genetically modified food. That's different than saying it's zero. No demonstrated risk. It's an ultra-low risk position. We're unwilling to accept risk. And maybe that's the right answer. You have to come up with your own answers to this. Okay? So while the affluent nations can certainly afford to adopt ultra-low risk positions and pay more for food produced by organic methods, the 1 billion chronically undernourished people of the low-income food deficient nations cannot. And one of the great tragedies of genetically modified foods is that they're not being used in Africa. And the reason they're not being used in Africa is that the agricultural market for Africa is Europe. Europe has a lot of reasons they don't like genetically modified foods, and they really relate to their culture. If Europe doesn't allow genetically modified foods, then they can't grow them in Africa. They can't take advantage of the drought resistance, and then they also can't now begin to use foods to improve human health. You can prevent river blindness with vitamin-enhanced crops. There are a lot of things you can do with this, okay? And it's not being done because of a debate, which is an important one, but the science on that is not equivocal at this point. This is not a Frankenfood. Okay? It may have impacts on society, but this isn't the monster that goes around murdering people in the dark and on ice sheets and all sorts of other things. So hope this is helpful. I think the big chickens look like monsters, by the way, right where we started. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for coming, and love to take your questions.